Collins. I'm a student member of Cambridge Zero Carbon Society, and I'm going to give a presentation today on climate justice, the University of Cambridge, and Cambridge Zero Carbon Society. So just to start off, I'll get this going. So in terms of the outline of the presentation, I'll start with a background on climate campaigning in Cambridge. I'll then give a rough outline of what a fossil-free university could look like, and then I'll point to some kind of future directions for climate campaigning in Cambridge. So to start with the introduction and context to who we are and what we've done, I think it's probably first necessary to clear up the difference between Cambridge Zero, the host of this festival, and Cambridge Zero Carbon Society, the group that I'm coming from. So Cambridge Zero Carbon Society was formed in 2007 by students and academics, and it was mainly a forum for talks, debates, and events relating to the climate crisis. Cambridge Zero was obviously formed last year as the university's research and policy response to the climate crisis. I'm going to kind of address the elephant in the room and be honest, that amongst Cambridge Zero Carbon Society members, there was a lot of skepticism about the formation of Cambridge Zero. I'd say most immediately that concerned the name. Most obviously, it concerned the name. The biggest group on campus organising around the climate crisis for the past 8 years, and the university had kind of taken that name for its own response to the climate crisis. We also saw that particularly as it was the high point of our organising and activism around divestment as a diversionary tactic that allowed the university to sideline its failure to divest and respond instead by highlighting its new research initiative. We also had deep concerns about the emphasis within Cambridge Zero on climate repair. Climate repair technologies, otherwise known as geoengineering, are proposed large-scale solutions to mitigate the effects of climate change. These include things like refreezing the poles by spraying tiny particles of salt into the atmosphere via tall masts connected to ships, which makes surrounding clouds more reflective. Each technology comes with drawbacks, and a report published earlier this year by the Centre for International Environmental Law shows a large number of advocates of geoengineering hold a stake in the fossil fuel industry. This has led some climate scientists to label it a distraction by fossil fuel companies from effective climate solutions like transitioning to renewables. Another aspect of Cambridge Zero's research programme is advancing carbon capture and geological storage, a method involving capturing carbon dioxide, usually from large emitters such as factories, transporting and storing it underground. In response to this, EcoNexus and Biofuel Watch responded to Cambridge Zero launch and said, "We are alarmed to see Cambridgers succumb to fossil fuel interests to research on geoengineering under the Orwellian spin of climate repair." We're also concerned about work with the fossil fuel industry, particularly through the BP Institute, an institute of the University of Cambridge, which is endowed and funded by the oil giant BP and has links to geoengineering techniques such as carbon capture. But we're really glad that Cambridge Zero has invited us here today to highlight these links and discuss further what the university could do. Sorry, the fire alarm is just going off in my house. So I think someone's baking bread. But yeah, really glad we've had the opportunity to come here today and talk about the university's links to the fossil fuel industry. So to start with kind of Cambridge Zero Carbon Society's kind of basic principles, we recognise that climate change is political. It reflects the existing inequalities that are unfair and the exploitative nature of the capitalist system. And the climate crisis disproportionately affects marginalised communities as they have the least power and therefore are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate breakdown. Cambridge Zero Carbon Society stands in solidarity with those groups most affected by climate change and seek to amplify their voices rather than speak for them. We believe in a decolonial, just transition, which has at its heart the rights of Indigenous people, the rights of local communities, and justice for the global South. A chief goal of the campaign has been divestment, which we'll get onto more a little bit later, but this is urging the university and other institutions to stop investing in the fossil fuel industry, a symbolic act which stigmatizes the fossil fuel industry, the industry that is most responsible for the climate crisis. So in terms of Zero Carbon's approach, we take a multi-pronged approach. This involves lobbying, direct action, media, and outreach. So I'm just going to start with some kind of context on the divestment movement and Cambridge Zero Carbon Society. So in 2012, the global climate campaign 350.org launched a fossil-free divestment campaign to push institutions to divest or remove investments from the fossil fuel industry. The campaign led a Do the Math tour of colleges and universities in the US, fronted by author Naomi Klein and Indigenous activist Winona LaDuke. A year later, in October 2013, the fossil fuel divestment campaign came to the UK as Bill McKibben, author of the first general audience book on climate change, toured the UK with People and Planet, the student campaigning network. This launched the fossil-free campaign to divest UK universities' 5.2 billion investments in fossil fuel companies, with groups set up across the UK. The fossil-free movement modelled itself on the divestment tactic used by the 1980s anti-apartheid movement that used investments as a key tactic to pressure the South African government. This gained credibility as South Africa's Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who won a Nobel Peace Prize for his work on the anti-apartheid campaign, backed the campaign, once again, stating, we can join together as a world and put pressure where it counts. So the kind of logic behind this tactic was that in 2012, and the same is the case today, the fossil fuel industry's current existing reserves of fossil fuels would push us over the 1.5 degrees of warming necessary to keep the planet habitable. But at the same time as fossil fuel companies doing this, they are still searching for new reserves that will just push us further over that limit of warming. So just to give a kind of brief history of the Cambridge divestment movement, it can be seen in three distinct phases. And the first one surrounds the ACBELA Working Group in the first decision. So Cambridge's fossil fuel divestment movement began in 2012 with the Cambridge University Socially Responsible Investment Campaign. In early 2014, the group changed its name to Positive Investment Cambridge and widened its focus from pure divestment towards broader sustainable and social responsible investments. In 2015, Positive Investment Cambridge collected over 300 signatures from Cambridge Regent House, the formal democratic body of the university, to request the creation of a working group to review the ethical and environmental impact of the university's investment portfolio and to evaluate ways of making the university's investment portfolio better reflect the stated mission and core values of the university. Positive Investment Cambridge approached the university administration before the grace was submitted and reached an agreement on the terms of reference of the Ethical Investment Working Group. The working group's membership included Tilly Franklin, who was appointed as the Chief Investment Officer last year, and Ellen Quigley, who led the work on the most recent divestment report. As this group was being set up, this divestment working group, 4 students came together with a shared belief in the need for a political and campaigning environmental group at the university. They took over the existing Cambridge Zero Carbon Society, which had put on talks on environmental issues since 2007. Cambridge Zero Carbon Society launched publicly in November 2015 with a coordinated banner drop over Garrett Hostel, Clare and King's Bridges. Angus Satow, Cambridge Zero Carbon Society founder and campaigns officer, was deemed, formally punished by the university as a result of the protest. Later that month, KUSU Council, the representative body for students, backed Cambridge Zero Carbon's campaign and provided a grant of £600. Part of that was to cover the fine that Angus received. At the same time, a petition calling on the university to withdraw its fossil fuel stocks, bonds and investments reached over 1,000 signatures in 3 days. In April 2016, Zero Carbon released a report calling on the university to withdraw its investment from the fossil fuel sector. The report included a foreword by Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury and then Master of Magdalen College. This was followed by a 250-strong divestment march, culminating in a petition, now with over 2,100 signatures, and an open letter calling for divestment being handed to the university's ceremonial officer. The year culminated in the publication of the ACBELA Working Group on Investment Responsibility in June 2016. The group had met 10 times, received written evidence, and interviewed 18 witnesses, including the Independent Petroleum Association of America, a lobbying group associated with trying to block climate action and pushing misleading climate science. And they also interviewed the former BP Chief Executive, Lord Brown. They refused to interview Cambridge Zero Carbon Society. The working group did not recommend full divestment and instead issued 9 recommendations in 3 categories: informing, influencing, and implementing. The first year of divestment campaigning in Cambridge contained many of the ingredients that will characterise the campaign over the next 4 years. One ingredient was a new form of engagement with the university's official decision-making processes. Prior to this, there was very limited and intermittent dialogue between decision makers and students, but Positive Investment Cambridge and Zero Carbon Society engaged with the official decision-making processes. Positive Investment Cambridge organised the GRACE, and 2 of its members were represented on the working group through CUSU, while Cambridge Zero Carbon Society submitted its report to the group. At the same time, both groups recognised the limitations of this and heavily criticised the university's working groups for investments for a lack of student involvement and opaque methods of participation. Another key component of divestment campaigning was the use of direct action and protest. The banner drops you can see on the presentation, and protests coordinated by Zero Carbon attracted widespread media attention, visibly demonstrated support, and aimed to disrupt the university's image. Building on this, the third element of the divestment campaign was an effective press strategy, which succeeded in ensuring the campaign was covered extensively in the student press and gained national media coverage frequently within its first year. So after the ACBELA report and the first rejection of divestment, students were undeterred and continued to campaign for full divestment. And building on this kind of past experience, Zero Carbon carried on many of its key strategies through to the next phase of campaigning. The first of these strategies was to continue working with the university's official decision-making processes. This initially centred around a new GRACE, proposing that none of the university endowment funds should be invested directly or indirectly in companies whose business is wholly or substantially concerned with the extraction of fossil fuels. And it required that the council, the kind of government of the university, publish a report to the university within 12 months, setting out how this should be achieved. In January 2017, this GRACE was approved by Regent House. However, despite the university's sovereign body, Regent House, calling for the university to divest, this was ignored by the University Council. The GRACE was approved with the caveat it was only advisory. This allowed Council not to carry out full divestment as called for in the GRACE, without having to submit a report to Regent House explaining their decision. In the wake of this decision, Cambridge Zero Carbon Society turned their attention to the second key campaign strategy: protest and direct action. Members tied red ribbons to bridges, railing and trees around Cambridge, held a silent protest outside Senate House, and held a climate kickabout on the Senate House lawn, all wearing masks with the faces of world leaders. In May 2017, the university established the second working group, to be chaired by Dame Athene Donald, to consider questions related to disinvestment, specifically the advantages and disadvantages of divestment. Continue with their strategy of direct involvement in university governance. In accordance with the terms of the working group, Alice Guillaume joined the working group as a Zero Carbon representative. The third element of campaigning focused on building support for divestment both in the university and beyond. Over 60 academics and activists added their name to a submission, co-written by the National Union of Students and People and Planet, calling on the university to divest from fossil fuels. Signatories included renowned academic Noam Chomsky, Cambridge MP Daniel Zeichner, NUS President Shakra Martin, and CUSU President Daisy Eyre. 20 faith leaders from the Cambridge community signed an open letter calling for the university to fully divest from fossil fuels, and CUSU Council voted unanimously to affirm its support for divestment, mandating its sabbatical officers to work closely with Cambridge Zero Carbon Society to support their campaign. Support also came from further afield as the Movement for the Survival of the Ogoni People, MOSOP, an organisation campaigning for environmental justice in the Niger Delta region of Nigeria, joined calls for divestment, demanding that the University of Cambridge cut all ties with Shell. This followed a 2009 article in The Guardian, which revealed that Shell paid $15.5 million in a settlement for having collaborated with the Nigerian government to execute leaders of MOSOP. In November 2017, documents released as part of the Paradise Papers leak showed that the University of Cambridge and Oxford and several of their constituent colleges had avoided tax through offshore investments. According to the documents, Cambridge had invested 1.3 million and Oxford 2.6 million in Collier International, which in turn invested in Royal Dutch Shell, Extreme Coil and the Shell Technology Ventures Fund, all of which were involved in oil exploration and production. Writing in The Guardian, Zero Carbon members and their counterparts at the University of Oxford condemned the hypocrisy of universities that espouse their commitment to sustainability whilst financing environmental destruction offshore. In response, Zero Carbon ramped up their focus on direct action, interrupting an engineering event attended by both BP and Shell, coordinating a protest, and setting off smoke grenades on King's Parade as part of a national day of action. Over the next few months, Zero Carbon staged a climate crime scene outside the University Investment Office, held a mock wedding between Mr. Shell and Miss Cambridge outside a meeting of the university's Finance and Business Committee, and together with Oxford Climate Justice, dropped a banner from Hammersmith Bridge during the men's Oxford varsity boat race. In March, Cambridge Zero Carbon condemned a leaked draft version of the report, saying it espouses a deeply anti-democratic and willfully blind attitude amongst university management towards divestment. The Zero Carbon representative, Alice Guillemin, resigned from the Divestment Working Group, arguing in varsity that the report fails to address the urgency of climate change and the injustices it engenders. Crucially, the report did not recommend that the university commit to full divestment in fossil fuels. It instead opted for considered divestment, which would preserve a policy position of avoiding direct investments in coal and tar sands and keeping indirect investments to a minimum. The report also recommended the university commit to UN principles of responsible investment and that 10% of indirect investments were placed in environmental, social and governance funds that were consistent with a carbon neutral future. As divestment discussions began in April, Cambridge Zero Carbon escalated pressure on the university. Activists occupied the finance offices at Greenwich House, and around 40 Cambridge Zero Carbon members gathered outside the first University Council meeting. At the time, Marcel Pasquina, University Council-elect and prominent Zero Carbon member, spoke to varsity about student representative within the university governance structures. He said, "It's a recurring problem here in the universities. Students have a seat at the table, but they don't have a voice. We are represented, but we are not listened to." In the weeks leading up to May and the University Council meeting to decide on divestment for a second time, 3 Zero Carbon members took part in a hunger strike. Zero Carbon chalk sprayed the walls of old schools, and over 200 students rallied outside old schools in a D-Day rally on the day set for the decision. Zero Carbon members also occupied Greenwich House, a building holding several administrative officers for 7 days before being forcibly evicted and several students being physically dragged out by bailiffs. This forced eviction was condemned in an open letter by staff, students and alumni, and over 100 students gathered outside Senate House to protest it. Zero Carbon staged a triple banner drop over the bridges of the River Cam, and over 200 Cambridge academics signed an open letter calling on the university to reject the recommendations of the Divestment Working Group and to instead commit to full divestment. 16 MPs, including Diane Abbott, John McDonnell and Caroline Lucas, also called on the University of Cambridge to commit to fully divest its £6.3 billion endowment. Despite this considerable pressure from students, staff and prominent figures outside the university, on the 8th of June, the university decided to vote against full divestment at a landmark meeting and instead accept the majority of the suggestions outlined in the controversial Divestment Working Group report. Almost a week later, on the 15th of June, the university officially confirmed its decision against divestment. The CUSU president and the graduate union president both dissented from the council's decision, arguing that Cambridge is taking a reputational, financial and ethical risk by not fully divesting. The University Council also rejected the Divestment Working Group's recommendation that it commit to 10% of the CUEF, the Cambridge University Endowment Fund, to explicitly ESG funds, instead announcing the intention to hire an ESG fund officer. Cambridge Zero Carbon Society criticised this as watering down the proposal of its working group and hiding from democratic accountability. They added, Cambridge is not failing to lead, but failing to follow, and argued that this decision marks a day of shame for our university. In the wake of the decision, Zero Carbon formally challenged the University Council's decision not to divest from the fossil fuel sector, claiming the council's methods subverted the university's democratic structures. A second formal review was submitted by a group of Cambridge academics. In September, and following the constant pressure of divestment, 4 senior members of the Cambridge Investment Officer resigned from their position out of a staff of 9. This included the Chief Investment Officer, Nick Cavallo, whose resignation Cambridge Zero Carbon had previously called for, and who had been a consistent and strong opponent of divestment. And this brings us to the third divestment decision and the Quigley Report. So since the 2018 Divestment Working Group, climate campaigning in Cambridge has focused on 4 major threads. The first major thread was a strategic shift to focusing on colleges rather than the central university. The shift followed investigations by Varsity in the Oxford student newspaper Cherwell that revealed that 7 Cambridge colleges held 20.7 million in direct investments in corporations engaged in oil and gas exploration, production and refining. This was followed by a coordinated banner drop across 11 colleges and a march that convened outside Senate House. Following this, 15 college campaigns were started or renewed. 2 colleges, Clare Hall and Queen's, divested in 2019, with a further 5, Selwyn, Emmanuel, Downing, Peterhouse and Jesus, announcing they had partially divested. Following XR's recent direct action campaign, Newnham, Robinson, St John's, Fitzwilliam have all publicly announced for the first time they are partially divested from the fossil fuel industry. In addition to this, Kings and Gonville Keys have announced they hold no direct investments, but have not ruled out holding them in the future. The second major thread was a decision. The second major thread was a campaign to discredit the Divestment Working Group and the 2018 decision against divestment. The groundwork was set the previous year when Cambridge Zero Carbon representative on the Divestment Working Group, Alice Guillemin, resigned in protest at a draft report. In early 2019, it was revealed that 2 members of the Divestment Working Group did not disclose or admit as a conflict of interest that they were directly involved in 2 proposed donations to Cambridge from mining and petroleum companies, BHP Billion and BP. In response, Cambridge Zero Carbon called on the university to revoke the Divestment Working Group and begin an immediate, transparent and democratic process to investigate how they can fully divest from fossil fuels. In February, 180 students marched through Cambridge in protest and 20 Cambridge Zero Carbon members blockaded the BP Institute. This allowed Cambridge Zero Carbon to establish a third major thread of their work, a new process for the university to consider divestment. This was achieved through a grace signed by over 300 Regent House members calling for a new report into the advantages and disadvantages of divestment to be produced. In April, the university committed to producing such a report. The new report was to be led by Dr. Ellen Quigley, a researcher appointed to initiate work on a part-time basis before the appointment of an ESG officer. A new position agreed on the 2017 recommendation of the Divestment Working Group. Dr. Quigley's report involved the coordination of a programme of events, consultations, workshops and seminars aimed at listening, recording and synthesising views from across the university on the question of divestment and responsible investment more broadly, and to educate the various constituencies within the university about responsible investment and providing guidance on best practice, both through academic literature and information produced for responsible asset holders. As a result of Dr. Quigley's recommendations, the university joined the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change and the Responsible Investment Network Universities. This was approved by the University Council. The fourth thread of Cambridge Zero Carbon's campaign centred around a report entitled Dismantling the Fossil Fuel University. This was written by Cambridge Zero Carbon Society members and published in October 2019. The report builds on the Divestment Working Group's collaboration with the fossil fuel industry and the links particularly between 2 members of the fossil fuel industry, 2 members of the Divestment Working Group and the fossil fuel industry. The report details the extensive links between the University of Cambridge and the fossil fuel industry beyond divestment. This includes a research project led by the director of Cambridge BP, the Cambridge BP Institute, which amounted to an estimated value to oil production companies of between $300 million and $3 billion a year, and information on CASP, formerly called the Cambridge Arctic Shelf Programme, whose researchers have led searches for oil and gas in the Arctic and other regions. It also details the revolving door of recruitment practices between the university and the fossil fuel industry, and how professorships such as the Shell Professorship of Chemical Engineering and the BP Foundation Mackenzie Professorship of Earth Sciences allow fossil fuel industries to portray themselves as academically necessary and prestigious, charitable and scientifically rigorous. On the day of the release of this report, Cambridge Zero Carbon Society members blockaded the BP Institute and CASP. Shortly after the publication of this report, the university removed all online traces of its links to CASP. On Monday, the 4th of November, over 200 protesters gathered at a mass rally organised by Cambridge Zero Carbon Society to protest the university's extensive links with the fossil fuel industry. Building on the history of direct action, later that month, 30 students from Cambridge Zero Carbon Society, Cambridge Defend Education, and Demilitarised Cambridge launched a coordinated disruption of the BAE Systems and Schlumberger stalls at the Engineering, Science and Technology Careers Fair. Zero Carbon also staged their own greenwashing action. As coronavirus hit and the divestment decision loomed, Cambridge Zero Carbon began to refocus on divestment. On the 24th of August, with exactly 8 weeks to go until the October University Council meeting, that a decision on divestment was expected at, Cambridge Zero Carbon Society officially launched its countdown to divestment. And then on the 1st of October, it was announced that the University of Cambridge would fully divest from the fossil fuel industry by 2030, following the 5-year campaign by Cambridge Zero Carbon Society. This was a huge victory for the campaign that wouldn't have happened without the tireless work of students, staff, and community members. So yeah, I think it's best to kind of like understand divestment as a kind of 5-year process involving 3 really distinct phases, centering around 3 official decision-making processes. And there are a lot of kind of core themes to draw out of that. And I think it's really sad that students had to push for a line to be included in the university's official announcement of divestment, that students and staff have contributed to the decision, when in fact it was students and staff who have led this decision, who have led and pushed and fought for this decision for over 5 years. So where next for climate campaigning? I think there are kind of like 3 threads that need to be tied up. So the first is, we kind of touched on this earlier, college divestment. So Cambridge operates a collegiate structure. The university has its own central endowment, but each of the 31 colleges also has separate investments in the fossil fuel industry. So 15 colleges have divested from the fossil fuel industry, and following the university's announcement, 2 more, Christ College and Lucy Cavendish, have announced they've divested. So yeah, one of the threads that Zero Carbon will really be pushing is for all the 31 colleges of Cambridge to fully divest from the fossil fuel industry. The second major thread will be to push the university further on its investments. So we were really happy with the university's decision to divest. As we said at the time, this decision sends a resounding signal to BP, Shell and ExxonMobil. No more will Cambridge University profit from the communities who have decimated frontline communities, bankrolled misleading climate science, lobbied against environmental regulations, whilst continuing to explore for oil even as the planet burns. And while this announcement is a cause for celebration, we are clear that the fight is far from over. The decision comes 5 years too late, and the 2030 target is far too late. So we'll be continuing to campaign for this target to be brought forward and for the university to take more action through its investments. And the kind of third thread is something we again touched on earlier, about the kind of broader links between the university and the fossil fuel industry. And I'm just going to kind of go through those in a little bit more detail. So I think they can best be looked at, as is done in the report, through kind of 4 major themes. So the first is investments. So the money that the university has, which is invested in the fossil fuel industry. So Cambridge has an endowment of 6 billion and 377 million of that is invested in the fossil fuel industry. So as I mentioned, this will all be divested, so removed from the fossil fuel industry by 2030. The second is greenwashing. So what does this mean? What is this theme of the university's links to the fossil fuel industry? So fossil fuel companies use universities like Cambridge to maintain and bolster their social license to operate. The university takes money in exchange for greenwashing the industry, allowing it to co-opt the university's image and portray itself as prestigious, charitable, and scientifically rigorous. The university is open about this, offering, in their words, brand association benefits to companies. A few examples of this: the named professorships like the BP Professorship of Chemistry, awards and prizes like the ExxonMobil Prize, and events like the Shell Annual Lecture, as well as branded equipment like the BP lab coats that first-year chemistry undergraduates are provided. So the third theme is the revolving door. So the way that people move between the fossil fuel industry and the University of Cambridge. So that's things like training and consultancy events, recruitment events, advertising, and sponsored studentships and scholarships. It's also the way that executives co-occupy or move between positions in the fossil fuel industry and university management. And the fourth theme is extractive research. So we touched on this earlier. Particularly, I have the most kind of pertinent case of this is the BP Institute, the West Cambridge site that looks at multi-phase flow. So the BP Institute was set up after Cambridge scientist Dan Mackenzie made a discovery on seismic basins, which in his own words saved the fossil fuel industry probably around $5 billion a year. And after this, the BP Institute was set up as a thank you for this discovery. And at the BP Institute, research was developed that, according to an impact case study published by the university, has increased the profits of fossil fuel extraction by between $300 and $3,000 million a year. So does anyone have any questions kind of on the history of Cambridge Zero Carbon Society or the kind of future directions of Cambridge Zero Carbon?
Yeah, and just as house rules, if you're asking a question, you can either post it on the Q&A buttons on the bottom of the screen, or if you want to talk, I'll just unmute. Unmute you if you need to talk. Just raise your hand and I'll unmute you. And for the people who are listening on YouTube, you can post your questions on the chat box, and we'll give them to Ewan. Ewan, can you see that question from Joseph? He says, what are the plans around encouraging individual colleges to divest?
So what Cambridge Zero Carbon can do is put you in contact with other people at your college who are interested in getting individual colleges to divest, and also take broader action on the climate crisis. It doesn't have to just be divestment. So colleges can also establish targets for carbon neutrality and agree not to take donations from fossil fuel companies or individuals who've gained a lot of money from the fossil fuel industry. But yeah, what we can do is what we kind of did a couple of years ago, and we've done frequently since, is if people reach out to Cambridge Zero Carbon Society and say, I'm at a college, I want to start a divestment campaign, I want to restart a divestment campaign, because it's likely that conversations have already been had at your college. We can come in, speak to you online at the moment, and really provide you with a kind of toolkit of resources based on the experience of Cambridge Zero Carbon members achieving divestment at the Central University and at 15 other colleges, that will kind of give you a really clear pathway to understanding how the university, how you can make your college divest. So it'll include, probably start off with understanding what the situation is. How much does your college invest in the fossil fuel industry, and their resources we have? What will you then have to do once you've got that information? How can you build support amongst the students at your college? How can you build support amongst the academics at your college, the broader staff? How can you use the wider support of the community to pressure your college to divest? So yeah, we can really come in, and it'll obviously be up to you at your individual college based on your kind of analysis of the circumstances there to kind of take it forward. But we can really provide you with a blueprint and different ways that you could achieve divestment at your college.
Another question of that, Joseph says thank you. And another question: are only current students allowed to join, or alumni as well? And as part of that question, are you in touch with any other societies around the UK when it comes to this divestment?
Yeah. So Cambridge Zero Carbon is definitely open to alumni, and alumni have been like a really great source of support for us. And it's actually a particular campaign area. It's one of the working groups. So the way we operate is there'll be different areas of work that we're doing, and we'll establish a working group on each of those. So that'll be a few members of the campaign who will go away between our weekly meetings and work on those actions. And one of the working groups at the moment is working on alumni engagement. So yeah, I'll put the contact details up at the end, but if you're an alumni and interested in getting involved, please do get in touch, and you can become part of that working group and really shape those conversations about how alumni can be involved in the campaign. On the second question, which was, sorry, could you remember the second part of the question?
I'll say the question again. Yeah, so what about with groups in other places or in other universities around the UK? Are you in touch with them as well? Do you work in conjunction with them, or sort of, interact?
Yeah, this is a really great question. So I mentioned at the start that when the fossil fuel divestment movement came to the UK, it did so through a group called People and Planet. People and Planet are a really amazing charity and group and campaign organisation that dates back to the 1980s. And what they do, they coordinate student campaigns. So they have paid staff and two sabbatical officers. So former students, often who've been involved in campaigns, or always who've been involved in campaigns on campus, who go and work for People and Planet for a year to coordinate student campaigning across the UK. So this fossil-free divestment movement in the UK, which has seen half of UK universities divest from fossil fuels. So between 2012 and 2020, 8 years, 74 of the 150 UK universities have divested from fossil fuels, Cambridge being the most recent to do so. And this has all been coordinated by the People and Planet group. So People and Planet have got amazing resources, and that's how Cambridge Zero Carbon Society got set up. And we meet with them 3 or 4 times a year to share resources and ideas, and they can put us in contact with groups at other universities. So to just give one recent example of this, when we knew in early October that the university was going to announce that it would divest from fossil fuels, we used the contacts of People and Planet to reach out to the groups that exist at over 50 universities, for them to publicise and really raise awareness that Cambridge had divested, and we did that with nearly all of the previous divestment announcements. We announced it through our own social media channels, talked about it in our meetings, because to us it was a clear indication, if they can do it, why can't we? So yeah, if you're interested in kind of coordinating nationally or understanding more about how these groups work together, I'd just Google People and Planet, have a look through their resources, follow them on Facebook and Twitter. They put on amazing events. They over the summer put on a festival kind of like this one called Power Shift, which included an absolutely amazing program of events. So yeah, if you're interested in that, I'd really urge you to get in contact with People and Planet.
Another question, as a background, with you as a student of sociology, how do you basically bring your own background into the whole activism? Like, do you think that a lot of your background has a lot to play with it, or not really? Or you feel that everybody should basically come together?
I think it can be a factor. I don't know if it was particularly my background, like as a student of sociology, that led me to get involved with Cambridge Zero Carbon. But Cambridge Zero Carbon is open to all students studying all subjects. There's often a perception of those involved in kind of student activism and organising that it's very dominated by humanities students, but that's not actually the case in Cambridge Zero Carbon Society. There's a lot of scientists and STEM students involved in Cambridge Zero Carbon Society, and that's going to be a really key focus of the campaign over the next year or so. But yeah, in terms of my own background and how it affected me, I think for me as a student of sociology, you study social movements, what the way change is instituted, and I've learned more about that from being involved in Cambridge Zero Carbon Society and a few other campaigns than I have from all the books and theories, lectures and supervisions on how social change is instituted. So yeah, from the way that the press and media work, something I'm studying this week, I got a really key insight into that through looking at how Cambridge Zero Carbon Society use the press, in understanding how public opinion and pressure is leveraged, how you build support. Again, the work of Cambridge Zero Carbon Society kind of really taught me a lot about that. So I think there was definitely an interaction between my kind of academic interests in how society works and how social change occurs, and kind of the work of Cambridge Zero Carbon Society in kind of making that happen on a local level in Cambridge.
Excellent. And another question, this one comes from Bethany. Do you think COVID will affect the ability to protest and the visual impact protests have?
Yeah, definitely. But I think if we look at the past 6 months, we've seen probably the most inspiring, or at least one of the most inspiring, active and like seismic protest movements of the past 2 decades in the Black Lives Matter movement in the US and in the UK. Obviously, there are additional kind of precautions that must be taken if protests is to occur during the pandemic, and I think there's been a reassessment of priorities, particularly for students, around the university's response to the coronavirus pandemic, rather than its response to the climate crisis. But I think it's been talked about very widely that you cannot separate the coronavirus pandemic from the climate crisis. The breakdown in the barriers between wildlife and humanity really allow these zoonotic diseases that can be transferred between humans and animals become far more likely as the climate crisis worsens, and there's a decent degree of scientific consensus that as the climate crisis continues, pandemics such as this are going to become more and more likely, and our response to them is going to become more and more difficult to handle.
Thank you. Now from YouTube, Marion asks, could you share your social media platforms with us, please? So what are your social media platforms?
That's perfect timing on the question, because that was the next slide. So yeah, our Facebook is Cambridge Zero Carbon Society. Twitter is at Cambridge Zero Carbon SOC. And we also have a website which has tons of resources on it, all the kind of news and media coverage we've got. I think there's something like 7 reports we've written on divestment, wider links between the university and the climate crisis. But yeah, if anyone here is at the university and really wants to get an insight into the work of Cambridge Zero Carbon Society and where it's going to go, I'd really, really recommend, it's around 40 pages, but it's well written, clearly presented. It is the most recent report on dismantling the fossil fuel industry, which really goes through and shows all the links between the university and the fossil fuel industry. And that can be quite disheartening, but I think it also shows us what a lot of work we've got to do, and what potential there is for climate campaigning in Cambridge, and how important it is. Cambridge is a really key site of fossil fuel extraction, research, and greenwashing in the UK. I think you're muted.
There we go. 1 second. There's another question coming here with all the technology. All right. And yeah, and it should be important as well to emphasize the importance of the critical debate that considers all points of view. And this is part of the essence of the festival as well. And that, you know, we want everybody to be involved, and everybody has, you know, a voice. And it's wonderful that Ion is joining us today to tell us, you know, their side of the story. And so, yeah, if anybody else wants to participate, and you know, perhaps you have questions for the public and for people perhaps listening, watching on YouTube. So, what you know, would you have any question for the audience?
Yeah, I guess, yeah. If anyone would like to kind of speak up what their perception is, what they think the campaign could do more to kind of reach out to you, any feedback you'd have, that would be kind of like really useful to hear. Ways that you think you could get involved, or things you could bring to the campaign. Yeah, I'd be really keen to hear that.
Now I'm just looking at here. And so what are the next steps? I mean, you know, now that, you know, the university has says that, you know, it said that they're going to divest by such a date, what would you do next? I mean, are there still many things that need to be done before that date?
So yeah, one of them will be kind of like holding the university to account on that, and kind of saying, come on, you can do better than this. How are you doing this? What are you doing? So kind of checking up. So that'll be the first kind of thread of what we're doing. The second will be the college divestment thread. So the university has an endowment of 6 billion in total, the University of Cambridge as a whole. 3.5 billion of that is the Central University that is going to be divested by 2030. But then the other half of the university's investments in the fossil fuel industry come from the colleges. So we'll be continuing to support campaigns in colleges and calling on all the colleges of the University of Cambridge to divest. And the third thread is really focusing on the things that I've tried to emphasize in the talk today about the broader links between the university and the fossil fuel industry. I've suggested they can be kind of understood along the lines of greenwashing, extractive research, and the revolving door. And these are the really, really material ways that the university helps the fossil fuel industry and entrenches the climate crisis. So we'll be really focusing on those. We'll take a top-down approach on the one hand. So we'll be organising a grace calling on the university to cut all its links with the fossil fuel industry. And if you're a member of Regent House or know members of Regent House, please get in contact if you'd like to kind of sign that grace and put pressure on the university to cut links to the fossil fuel industry. But we'll also be taking a bottom-up approach. So like we did with the college campaigns, where whilst we were asking the university to divest from the top down, we put pressure from below through the colleges. We'll be doing that on a departmental level. So we'll be going to each of the departments of the university and saying, will you commit to not taking research grants from fossil fuel companies? Will you commit to not taking donations from fossil fuel companies? Will you commit to not inviting them to careers fairs? Will you commit to not giving out branded equipment? Will you commit to not doing consultancy or training for fossil fuel companies? So yeah, we'll be taking that kind of top down and that bottom up approach at the same time. But as always, our campaign strategy is not fixed. It's determined by the people who come in, get involved and shape the campaign. And it's a really, really accessible, inclusive and democratic space. So if you have got things that you think the campaign should be doing, the best way to make that happen is to just come along to a meeting on Saturday, 4 p.m. every week and make it happen. And we'll support you in that.
And another question that has come up as well, what about the community groups, the local community groups in Cambridge? Do you work in conjunction with them, or do you collaborate or plan things, or is it just very much university based?
Yeah, so we've worked kind of fairly extensively, and it comes in peaks and troughs. And it's kind of harder for us to do it in some ways, in that like most students are only here for 8 weeks at a time and aren't in Cambridge for half the year, so we don't have the same connection to the space. And we tend to be concentrated in the colleges. So there are definite limitations to that happening, but we do try and do it as much as possible. So we've worked particularly through the Keys to Ethical Affairs campaign with local community groups looking at kind of ecological and conservation efforts. And it's really amazing to see that some of them are represented and speaking on today's festival programme. So yeah, we do, and probably the most active collaboration we've done with local community groups is with the local youth strike group. So the photo that I think was on the first page of this presentation of a huge rally on the kind of on King's Parade was a really amazing event where students, staff, workers, and university students all came together in September last year to call for the kind of urgency of climate action.
Excellent. So does anybody else have any questions? I don't see any more questions, and I don't see any raised hands. Well, on that note then, we'll be finishing our session. Ian, thank you very much for joining us today. It has been wonderful to learn how you work and all the things you do and you're planning to do. And yes, and please join us for the rest of, basically the whole rest of the weekend today. There's plenty of sessions about community localism, and during the week as well, we have many more. And somebody else is saying, thank you for the talk and huge congratulations with all the work that went into the recent divestment. Oh, that's good. All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody. And please, like, this talk will be on YouTube recorded as well. So just tell your people and your groups to actually watch it as well. So thank you.
Thank you. Have a lovely weekend, everyone.